Carlos Alcaraz sat at the edge of the press room table, his fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface in a rhythm that revealed his calm demeanor. The room buzzed with anticipation, cameras flashing sporadically, and the hum of reporters' chatter filling the air. Everyone was there for one reason: to hear the announcement that had already shaken the tennis world before it was even made. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, Alcaraz adjusted the microphone in front of him, offering a brief, nervous smile. Despite his youth, he carried the poise of someone accustomed to the spotlight, though those closest to him could notice the subtle tension in his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, he leaned forward and began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I know there's been a lot of speculation, and I appreciate your patience. I want to share something very important to me, something that could redefine not just my career but my entire approach to this sport that I love." The room fell silent. Even the most seasoned journalists leaned in, pens poised, ready for the bombshell. Whispers about possible coaching changes or an extended break from tennis had been swirling, but Alcaraz's tone hinted at something more profound. "In recent months, I've been reflecting on my journey," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "As you know, I've been fortunate to experience incredible success at a young age. But with that success have come physical, mental, and emotional challenges I didn't fully anticipate. I've realized that to continue growing as both a player and a person, I need to make a change." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. A few murmurs broke the silence, but most eyes remained fixed on him. "I am officially announcing a transition to a new phase in my career, effective immediately. I will shift my focus toward a more holistic approach to tennis, one that prioritizes sustainability, mental well-being, and long-term development. This will involve changes in both my training methods and how I approach competition." The room erupted into a frenzy of questions and exclamations. Alcaraz raised a hand to calm the crowd, his face a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Let me explain," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This decision comes after months of discussions with my team, my family, and most importantly myself. Tennis has always been my passion, but I've come to understand that passion can't thrive under constant pressure and relentless demands. I want to play this sport not just for the next few years but for the next decade or more. To do that, I need to make changes now." As the details of his plan unfolded, Alcaraz explained that he had been working with a team of sports psychologists, nutritionists, and biomechanics experts to craft a program tailored to his unique needs. His new schedule would include longer breaks between tournaments, a departure from traditional training regimens, and a focus on developing other aspects of his life outside tennis. "Many of you might see this as a step back," he said, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to make everyone understand. "But I see it as a step forward. This isn't about playing less, it's about playing smarter. It's about ensuring that when I step onto the court, I'm not just physically ready but also mentally and emotionally prepared." The questions came quickly. "Carlos, does this mean you'll skip the Grand Slams?" one reporter asked, alarmed. Alcaraz shook his head firmly. "Not at all," he replied. "I plan to compete in all the major tournaments, but I will be more selective with smaller events. My focus will be on quality over quantity." Another journalist pressed for details about his training changes. "Will you be working with a new coach?" "Not exactly," Alcaraz responded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Juan Carlos Ferrero has been and will remain an essential part of my team, but we're bringing in additional specialists to focus on areas like mental resilience and recovery. It's about building a team that covers every aspect of what it takes to succeed in today's game." As the press conference progressed, reactions in the room ranged from skepticism to support. Some questioned whether the young star was making a mistake by deviating from the tried-and-true methods that had brought him so much success. Others applauded his courage to prioritize his well-being in a sport notorious for its grueling demands. When asked what had led to this decision, Alcaraz's expression turned serious. "I think it was a combination of things," he admitted. "After a particularly tough loss earlier this year, I found myself questioning what I was doing and why I was doing it. I realized I had been so focused on winning that I'd lost sight of the joy of playing. That was a wake-up call for me." He also spoke candidly about the physical toll of the sport. "Tennis is one of the most demanding sports on the body. The constant travel and back-to-back matches add up. If I want a long career, I need to proactively manage that strain." The press conference concluded with Alcaraz thanking his fans for their unwavering support. "I know this is a big change and might not make sense to everyone right away, but I promise that everything I'm doing is with the goal of being the best version of myself, for my fans, my family, and the sport." As he stepped away from the podium, the questions continued to swirl both in the room and online. Was this the beginning of a new era for Alcaraz or a gamble that could derail his meteoric rise? Only time would tell. What was clear, however, was that Carlos Alcaraz wasn't afraid to rewrite the rules of what it meant to be a tennis champion. Even as the room buzzed with speculation, Alcaraz remained seated, his demeanor calm yet introspective. The weight of his words had clearly left an impression on the gathered journalists. While their pens and cameras betrayed their eagerness for more details, Alcaraz's eyes scanned the faces before him, perhaps searching for understanding, perhaps gauging the impact of his revelation. With a subtle gesture, he signaled that he was open to more questions, his composed exterior masking the storm of emotions within. "Carlos, you mentioned working with a team of specialists, including psychologists and nutritionists. Could you explain some of the specific changes they've recommended?" Alcaraz nodded thoughtfully, intertwining his fingers as he leaned forward. "Of course. One of the biggest changes has been how I approach recovery. For years, recovery was something I thought about after a match, an ice bath here, a stretch there. But I've learned that recovery starts well before I even step off the court. It's in how I mentally prepare, how I listen to my body, and even how I breathe during high-pressure moments." He paused briefly, as if deciding how much to reveal. "For example, my team has introduced me to guided visualization techniques. It's not just about imagining success but also preparing my mind for setbacks. Visualizing moments when things don't go as planned and training my brain to respond calmly and strategically has completely changed how I handle pressure." A murmur of interest spread through the room. Guided visualization, more often associated with high-stakes executives or elite military units, wasn't a concept typically linked to the fast-paced world of tennis. Another reporter quickly followed up. "What about the physical side of things? Are we talking about drastic changes to your training regimen?" Alcaraz offered a slight smile. "Drastic might be too strong a word, but there have been significant adjustments. For example, we've moved away from a volume-focused approach. I've always been someone who loves to work hard, spending hours on the court and pushing my body to its limits. But I've realized that more isn't always better. Now, every exercise, every session has a purpose. If I'm working on my serve, it's not about hitting 100 balls, it's about hitting 10 perfect ones with full focus and intention." He leaned back slightly, his expression momentarily distant. "Honestly, it's tough for me. There's a part of me that feels like I'm not working hard enough if I don't leave the court drenched in sweat. But I'm learning to trust the process and understand that efficiency can be just as powerful as effort." The next question came from a seasoned journalist known for their probing inquiries. "Carlos, you've talked about mental resilience and physical recovery, but what about the emotional toll? Tennis is as much a mental game as it is a physical one. How are you addressing the pressures of being a global star at such a young age?" For the first time, a flicker of vulnerability crossed Alcaraz's face. "That's a great question," he said quietly. "The truth is, I'm still figuring it out. Being in the spotlight is something I've grown up with, but it's also something I've never fully understood. When I step on the court, I'm not just playing for myself. I'm playing for my team, my family, my country, and my fans. That's a lot to carry, and some days, it feels heavier than others." He hesitated before continuing. "One thing that's helped is learning to set boundaries. I used to feel like I had to always be on, always accessible, always smiling, always giving. But I've realized it's okay to say no sometimes. It's okay to step back and protect my energy. That doesn't mean I care any less about my fans or the sport, it means I'm trying to be the best version of myself both on and off the court." The room grew quieter, as if the weight of his honesty had momentarily silenced even the most cynical reporters. Alcaraz's willingness to address not only the technical aspects of his career but also the deeply personal ones was rare in the world of professional sports, where athletes often maintain a polished facade. A younger reporter broke the silence. "Carlos, earlier you mentioned that this decision might not make sense to everyone right away. What would you say to fans who are worried these changes might affect your performance or lead to fewer victories?" Alcaraz's eyes softened, and he offered a small, genuine smile. "I'd say I understand their concerns. I know what it feels like to want your favorite athlete to always be at their best, to always win. But I'd also tell them that this decision isn't about sacrificing success, it's about sustaining it. I want to be the kind of player who can give my best not just for the next few years but for the next 10 or 15. And to do that, I need to make these changes now while I still have the time and space to grow." He paused, as if searching for the right words. Tennis is an endurance sport. It's not just about who's the best today, it's about who can adapt, who can evolve, who can keep going when others can't. That's what I'm striving for, and I hope my fans trust me on this journey. The questions continued, delving deeper into every aspect of his decision. His thoughts on the current state of tennis, his relationships with fellow players, and even his goals for the future. Throughout it all, Alcaraz remained composed, his answers thoughtful and measured. It was clear this wasn't a decision he had made lightly. Every word he spoke reflected a deep understanding of both the risks and the potential rewards. As the press conference stretched on, the atmosphere shifted. The initial skepticism gave way to a sense of respect, even admiration. Alcaraz wasn't just announcing a change, he was challenging the status quo, redefining what it meant to be a champion in a sport that so often demanded relentless sacrifice. In the eyes of many in the room, Carlos Alcaraz wasn't just making adjustments to his career. He was paving the way for a new era in tennis. This wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter for Carlos Alcaraz, it marked the start of a revolution. As the flurry of questions continued without pause, Alcaraz remained composed, his confidence growing with each thoughtful answer. His presence at the table felt increasingly assured, every word he spoke carefully chosen, while reporters jotted down his statements with intensity. The atmosphere in the room had transformed into something far beyond a standard press conference. It felt like a pivotal moment in modern tennis history. A journalist from a prominent Spanish outlet raised their hand. "Carlos, you've spoken about mental resilience and recovery, but tennis is a sport deeply rooted in tradition. Many greats followed strict, conventional paths to success. Aren't you concerned that breaking away from that mold might invite criticism from purists who see this as straying from what has historically worked?" Alcaraz leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "That's a valid question, and it's something I've considered deeply," he admitted. "Tennis has a rich history, and I have immense respect for the champions who came before me. Their paths were extraordinary, but they were also unique to them. What worked for them might not work for me, or for future generations. The game is evolving. It's faster, more physical, and more demanding than ever before. I believe that as the sport changes, our approach to it must evolve too." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Tradition is important, but so is innovation. If we only do things the way they've always been done, we risk stagnation. I'm not trying to rewrite history or disrespect the traditions of this sport. I'm simply trying to write my own story in a way that feels authentic to who I am." The response struck a chord. For such a young player, Alcaraz's perspective carried the weight of someone far more experienced. He wasn't rejecting the past, he was building on it, carving out his own space in a sport that often demanded conformity. A reporter from a US network jumped in, their voice cutting through the murmurs. "Carlos, you've always been known for your aggressive playing style and relentless energy on the court. With this new approach, will we see a different version of you during matches? Could this change your style of play?" A small, knowing smile curved on Alcaraz's lips. "My playing style is a big part of who I am," he said, his tone confident yet measured. "I've built my career by being aggressive, taking risks, and playing with my heart. That's not going to change. What's changing is how I prepare for those moments. How I ensure I can bring that energy and intensity to every match, not just the big ones." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze direct. "Tennis is a game of margins. Sometimes, the difference between winning and losing isn't about talent or skill. It's about how well you've prepared, how effectively you've recovered, and how clear your mind is in those critical moments. That's what this is about. It's not about playing differently, it's about playing smarter." The room buzzed again as the implications of his words settled. Alcaraz wasn't abandoning the fearless, electric style of play that had made him a global sensation. Instead, he was refining the process that enabled him to execute it at the highest level. It was a distinction that spoke volumes about his maturity and vision. A question from the back of the room shifted the focus. "Carlos, we've talked a lot about the physical and mental aspects of your decision, but you also mentioned developing other parts of your life outside tennis. What does that look like for you in the future?" For the first time during the press conference, Alcaraz's expression softened into something almost wistful. "Tennis has been my whole life for as long as I can remember," he began. "And I love it, it's my passion, my purpose. But I've realized that if I want to be the best version of myself on the court, I need to be a whole person off the court too." He glanced down at his hands briefly before continuing. "That means spending more time with my family and friends, exploring interests outside of tennis, and even just taking time to rest and recharge. I've started reading more, traveling for reasons other than tournaments, and learning about things that have nothing to do with sports. It's about building a life that feels fulfilling so that when I step on the court, I'm playing from a place of joy, not just obligation." His words resonated on a level that transcended sports. In a world where athletes were often reduced to their performance metrics, Alcaraz's perspective offered a rare glimpse of humanity. He wasn't just an athlete chasing titles. He was a young man striving to balance his career with a meaningful life. The room grew quieter, as if the weight of his honesty had momentarily stilled even the most critical voices. What Carlos Alcaraz was doing wasn't just about adapting to the evolving demands of tennis, it was about reshaping the narrative of what it meant to be a champion in an unforgiving sport. And in that moment, it was clear he wasn't afraid to chart his own course. Alcaraz's emphasis on personal growth and balance felt like a breath of fresh air. As the discussion continued, a reporter from a prominent European outlet posed a thought-provoking question. Carlos, you're still very young, yet you're making decisions that most athletes don't consider until much later in their careers. What's driving this sense of urgency? Alcaraz's gaze sharpened, his youthful features briefly shadowed by the weight of his thoughts. I think it's because I've seen what happens when you wait too long to make these kinds of changes, he said softly. I've watched players I admire struggle with injuries, burnout, and the mental toll of constantly being in the spotlight. Some of them had incredible careers, but they paid a high price for it. I don't want to wait until it's too late to take care of myself. I want to make these adjustments now, while I still have the chance to shape my future. His voice grew steadier as he continued. I love this sport, and I want to give it my all. But I also want to look back one day and feel proud, not just of what I achieved, but of how I achieved it. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath, captivated by the clarity and conviction in his words. Alcaraz wasn't just setting a precedent for his own career, he was challenging the entire framework of what it meant to be a professional athlete in today's world. As the press conference progressed, the questions grew more nuanced, delving into the broader implications of his decision. Would other players follow his lead? Could this signal a shift in how athletes approach their careers? The answers were uncertain, but one thing was clear. Carlos Alcaraz had ignited a conversation that would echo far beyond the walls of that press room. The hum of chatter filled the space as a journalist from a renowned British outlet stood up, flipping through prepared questions before settling on one. Clearing their throat, they began. Carlos, you mentioned earlier your intention to step back from smaller tournaments. Can you explain what this means for your ranking and your position in the sport? Aren't you worried about losing momentum or points that could impact your standing at the top? Leaning into the microphone, Alcaraz maintained his calm, thoughtful demeanor. That's a great question, and it's something my team and I have discussed at length. Rankings are important, of course. They open doors, determine seedings, and influence many aspects of a player's career. But at the same time, they can't be the sole focus. Chasing points relentlessly can sometimes come at the cost of long-term sustainability. I've seen it happen to other players, and I don't want it to happen to me. He paused, scanning the room, making deliberate eye contact with several reporters. This isn't about giving up on competing or letting my ranking drop. It's about making strategic choices. By focusing on fewer tournaments, I can ensure I'm at peak performance for the ones I do play. And when I'm at my best, I believe I can compete with anyone, anywhere, regardless of my ranking. His confidence wasn't arrogant, it was measured and rooted in a clear understanding of his abilities and goals. I want my career to be about quality, not quantity, he continued. It's not about how many trophies I win, but the meaning behind those victories and the legacy I leave behind. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room as reporters scribbled notes. The idea of prioritizing legacy over rankings was bold, especially for someone so early in their career. It reflected a maturity that many found surprising, even admirable. A younger journalist, likely new to the circuit, hesitantly raised their hand. Carlos, you've spoken about legacy and long-term goals. Could you share what kind of legacy you hope to leave behind in tennis? Carlos tilted his head slightly, considering the question. I think about legacy a lot, he admitted. For me, it's not just about being remembered as a great player. I want to be remembered as someone who changed the way people thought about the game, how they approached it, played it, and lived it. He leaned forward, his expression serious. I want younger players to see that you can succeed without sacrificing your health or happiness. That you can compete at the highest level while still respecting yourself and the people around you. If I can inspire even a few players to prioritize their well-being and approach the sport with balance, then I'll consider that a significant part of my legacy. The room fell silent for a moment, his words resonating deeply. It was a stark contrast to the traditional narrative of champions pushing themselves to the brink, sacrificing everything for success. Alcaraz was proposing a new path forward, one that valued sustainability as much as achievement. Another question came, this time from a journalist representing a major U.S. sports network. Carlos, we've seen athletes in other sports advocate for mental health and balance, but it's still a relatively new concept in tennis. Do you see yourself as a pioneer in this regard? Alcaraz hesitated briefly, as if the weight of the term pioneer rested heavily on his shoulders. I wouldn't call myself a pioneer, he said modestly. There have been players before me who spoke about the importance of mental health and balance. What I'm doing is simply building on the conversations they started. If anything, I feel fortunate to be part of a moment where those conversations are happening more openly. His tone became more reflective. But I also know there's still a lot of stigma, especially in tennis, where toughness and resilience are so highly valued. I felt it myself, the expectation to always be strong, to never show vulnerability. But I think real strength comes from acknowledging those challenges and addressing them head-on. That's what I'm trying to do, and I hope it encourages others to do the same. Alcaraz wasn't just redefining his own career, he was quietly challenging the entire culture of the sport, carving out a space where both success and well-being could coexist. The room buzzed with a sense of admiration, his words sparking a broader reflection on what it truly means to be a champion in the modern era. It's a culture that makes it hard to admit when you're struggling or need support. Straightening slightly, his voice took on a firmer tone. If my decisions can help normalize those conversations and show that taking care of yourself doesn't make you weak, then I'm happy to do my part. Because at the end of the day, being mentally strong isn't about never struggling, it's about knowing how to face those struggles. The room erupted again, but this time with a different energy. Alcaraz wasn't just defending his choices, he was challenging an entire culture within tennis. His words carried an undertone of defiance, not against the sport itself, but against the rigid expectations often tied to it. A journalist from a leading Australian outlet raised their hand next. Carlos, you mentioned earlier that you've started exploring interests outside of tennis. Can you tell us more about what those are? What have you discovered about yourself in the process? A small smile crossed Carlos's face, the first genuine moment of lightness in the conference. It's funny because for so long, I didn't really know who I was outside of tennis, he admitted. I would wake up, train, compete, and go to bed. That was it. I never thought much about anything else. But stepping back a little has made me realize there's so much more out there. He glanced down briefly, as if reflecting on the weight of his own words. For starters, I've been learning to play the guitar. I'm terrible at it, he added with a laugh, but it's been fun to have something where the goal isn't perfection, it's just to enjoy it. I've also started exploring photography and experimenting with cooking, though my team would probably say I'm better at eating than cooking. The room broke into soft laughter, a welcome pause from the serious tone of the discussion. Carlos's openness added a layer of relatability to his already inspiring story. But more than anything, he continued, I've discovered the importance of slowing down. For so long, it felt like I was sprinting through life, always chasing the next milestone. Now I'm learning to appreciate the journey, the small moments, the people around me, and the experiences that make life rich. The honesty in his words struck a chord, especially in a world often consumed by an unrelenting hustle culture. Carlos Alcaraz was choosing a different path, one that prioritized presence and intentionality over constant motion. It wasn't just a message for tennis players, it was a message for everyone.